Thanks so much, Ron. Appreciate the opportunity to speak here. Just by way of introduction, my name is Ron Miller, so I'm a solutions architect here at AWS. I've been here for a little over 2 years, but I've worked across multiple industries doing solution architect and software engineering work. And at the moment, I think like most of us, we're riding the generative AI wave. So there's a lot going on in this space, and it's dubbed to be the $1 trillion promise that Gartner has laid out for us. So I'm planned to have a session today just to talk about data compliance and privacy considerations. I intentionally left this not to be like completely technical, not fully AWS service based, but purely just about the concepts of how we can incorporate responsible AI into how we develop our generative AI applications and the things that we should consider when we're applying these to our applications. So I'll just move on here. So let's just start with responsible AI. We've outlined this framework to lay out what responsible AI is, and a few of these really aren't technical at all. You know, things like robustness, you know, you can say is technical. It's about the resiliency of the application, or fairness is how the model reacts to certain inputs. But on the bottom row, we have things like privacy and security, governance, and transparency, which may have a technical aspect, but are predominantly just processes and things to keep in mind as you're developing AI, and also ways to communicate how that application is used across your organization and or shared with your customers that may use it as well. So for this session, we'll focus more on the privacy, governance, and transparency pieces. So when we think about generative AI, we do have this mental model that we have at AWS to kind of identify like what type of generative AI application it is. And we just laid it out in different scopes. So scope one would be a consumer application. So this would be like a public app. So one example of this on AWS is a Party Rock. So essentially it's just a playground where you can go in, sign up for an account without AWS, and you can just play around with generative AI and see how it works. But the idea is it is a public website. There is terms and conditions applied to it, but whatever you put in there gets fed directly into that application without any specificity about like who controls that data. That's really the key. A scope two would be more of an enterprise application. So it's still a software as a service kind of application, except the SLAs may be wrapped around it, or there may be some controls that you can take advantage of to align it with your enterprise requirements. So one example of that would be Code Whisperer. So that's our code suggesting artificial intelligence that integrates with an IDE. But the thing about it is like, it's going to have controls in place that align with your code processes and whatnot, and integrates with your enterprise as a whole. So it's not something that you publicly sign up for, it's something that you subscribe to and that your organization aligns to. So we aligned those type of applications into a scope two, and both scope one and scope two we consider to be pre-built. So these are working right out of the box. It may improve as you use it, but predominantly the model itself is managed by the provider of these services. Don't worry, there's just 5 scopes. So for scope 3, we're looking at pre-trained models. And we're starting to look at generative AI in a way that we're building or self-building applications that leverage these kind of services. So one example of that would be Amazon Bedrock. So that's where you can leverage the foundation model that's behind it through this kind of service. And everything is pre-trained by the model providers. Um, and you can leverage it in your environment, and you have greater control over it since it's integrated with your authorization or authentication layers. And when we talk about scope 4, that's when we start to incorporate our own data into those self-built applications. So an example of that is to um, fine-tune, train the Bedrock Foundation models with my own data. So that might be documents that I'm looking to summarize. It could be call transcriptions that I want to detect or generate a summary of for my QA report. So fine-tuned models adds the additional layer that I'm actually contributing in addition to my prompt data, actual data that from my organization that's used against these models. And then finally, scope 5 would be self-trained models. So this is where you're actually building your own models. Like if you're SageMaker savvy, you would go in there, custom build your model from scratch, and use that. And this gives you the full control of the model data and also how the model itself is actually trained. But with that comes responsibility. So I'd say as you move higher in scope, your responsibility for ensuring that we're transparent with what data is put into that model becomes part of your overall strategy creating these applications. All right, so now across all these scopes, we do have to think about securing, so things like governance, risk management, resilience, all these factor in across all these scopes. And it may vary a little bit, but typically as you go to more self-trained models, there's additional parameters to think about because the responsibility of it increases. All right, so I just tried to summarize where the challenges may be from a governance perspective and things to think about, and also considerations of how to approach those. So for pre-built models, I put these together in scope 1 and 2. So in this case, we're essentially using the model directly, and the customer data is really our inputs to the prompts. So one of the challenges that occurs in these scopes is that there's uncontrolled use of models. A lot of these websites are publicly available. They may not even have authentication required. And users are just used to having the convenience of just typing in a question and getting a meaningful answer back. But as an organization or an enterprise looks at this, this becomes an issue to control how your data leaves and also enters your organization. Additionally, because these are fully managed, there's also a licensing agreement associated to that. So changing terms happens all the time. It could happen on short notice, and it could in turn affect how you look at how that application is used to meet your own compliance and risk requirements for your company. As well as data residency. I mean, I think our audience here is predominantly in North America, and all the model providers are in North America as well. But as you scale out globally, we run into other compliance issues like GDPR or certain data residency requirements depending on that country. So also thinking globally can present a challenge as we're looking at managed models and where that data is actually residing, and also how that company is handling it.
I should point out we do have people like Amy, who's out there in the UK, who is the head of global risk for CIMB, a big primarily financial institution actually outside North America. But the other thing I think to keep in mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, even if you're predominantly in the US, if any of your data backups, or even if you have employees or contractors, either in UK or any of the EU countries, you're still required and are bound by GDPR. So just be aware of things. And just to provide a related issue, even within the domestic 48 continental states, there are emerging state-specific data privacy laws, such as California has its own law, Ohio has its own law. And so even if you're just absolutely in North America, understanding the complexity, understanding not just international jurisdictions, but state-specific and could be city-specific issues, place a greater premium on making sure you're working with experts like AWS and others to ensure that you're compliant with an increasingly complicated and fast-moving landscape.
Absolutely, well said, Ron. And in this case, because it's managed, the task there is to understand how it's being done, right? So as we move into other scopes, you have a little more control of that. But I mean, just to dive into some of the approaches, I mean, to be responsible in this area, we have to understand how the data is accessed, how it's stored, who has access to that data, where it's being, is it properly being secured? So all those questions you should ask. I mean, Party Rock may not be a good example for that since it's just a playground. But if you're using other enterprise level managed generative AI applications, these are definitely questions you need to find answers for. And that's one of the approaches that we should look at when we're deploying these kind of scope 1, scope 2 applications. As well as licensing changes. So how your data is used, sometimes in these agreements, there's an opt-in to whether your prompts are used to retrain the model. So there might be an option to opt out of that. You may want to keep in mind that the model provider may decide to change that along the way to, of course, improve their product, but it may affect how you see the application today. So definitely setting up a process to monitor license changes, data access are definitely key to deploying these in an enterprise. But going back, I mean, the main thing is like users are typically not rogue. They're not going out and putting in random data into random applications just to save a few minutes. I think at the end of the day, if they know that anything, because for scope 1 especially, we kind of treat anything we put into these applications as public data. As long as they know that hey, I shouldn't put in proprietary data that's in my enterprise, users tend not to do that. So I mean, the task for us as managing it is to first classify the data that we have. Is customer data okay? Is just general questions about, I don't know, physical facilities one thing that is an acceptable classification we can use the app for. I mean, essentially, it's a documentation exercise. Providing that classification to the user and also providing a mechanism to know that the user has read and understands how these applications should be used. So I think the main takeaway there is just more governance and documentation and really treating this as any other application that you would deploy in your enterprise. So as we look at scope 3 and 5, this is where we're incorporating our own data into the application. We may be fine tuning it. We may also be making our own models. And some of the challenges are still the same. We still need to manage, how the data is used, how the application should be used. But now we have challenges of like, where did the source data come from that trained the model that I had? So in the fine tuning model, it would be, the documents that I put there and, controlling and understanding what's there also leads to the second point, which is just the accuracy of the model at the end of the day. So these are things to keep in mind as you start exploring extending your generative AI applications for this use. So in addition to like taking care of the source data, there is one important thing that has come up and seems to reoccur is about copyrights. I mean, a lot of models that are out there may not it's one of those words, indemnify a user from the copyright law that may be from the source data that that model was trained on. So that's one thing to keep in mind as you're using the foundational models, for example, that may be in Bedrock, that there is some type of language about the copyright. So if the model was used for that or not, and if it is, are you exempt from any law action as a result of that? So that's one point. A second thing is like we have in security, there's always the principle of least privilege. Well, it's the same with data. And as we start tuning the models with our own data, in this case, less is usually more. You know, we're kind of tempted to just throw everything at the model and just see what comes out of it. But at that point, we've kind of lost control of what the model actually knows. And as of, you know, our current technology, we can't just unlearn it from a model. You actually have to retrain it and kind of retrain it to not know what you have already told it to know. So approaching that from the beginning, the forefront, and just understanding what data is being used is key to a successful deployment of that. Also, human in the loop. We always want to incorporate that, and this is resonant even in the compliance pieces of it, that we need a human in the loop to just verify the data, at least give feedback on the data that it is accurate, and that just helps further tune the model as well as a side effect. And as we move into being our own model provider, just being transparent, I think that's key for any compliance framework that's coming up, and we'll talk about it in the next slides. So from a compliance perspective, I'm sure we're all kind of seeing a lot in the news these days, and even just last year in October, I think it's all kind of started out that generative AI has kind of taken the main stage. Governments are reacting to controlling the effect of that. But even till today, there's still no global approach on the use of AI. And in fact, there's over 1,000 initiatives that are happening at this moment that are also in different jurisdictions across the world. So this is ever evolving, and we still need to rely on our existing standards. So things like GDPR, as we mentioned already, but also ISO standards to effectively regulate the data and how we're treating it across our systems. There's nothing really different here, except there's a model in the middle of that. So we need to consider how that affects where our data is used. Additionally, there is a new ISO framework standard, so 42001, which is starting to define, you know, how AI should be leveraged out there. That's also something that AWS is contributing to get us closer to some sort of standard. And I think in summary, like I just wanted to take like a couple minutes to talk about the considerations when we think about regulatory. Like we can only do what we know right now, and we know that that landscape is changing. So as long as we stick to some principles that as we're deploying generative AI into our enterprises, we can adapt and see how that landscape evolves and adapt, so we don't have to go back and retrain models and create that cost for us. So things like data privacy, still just like any other data in your organization, there needs to be a risk assessment process. And you know, this should also involve your legal team. So legal counsel, or some organizations now have a data protection officer. So these kind of conversations still need to happen, not just from, you know, typically it's a data warehouse or database, but it's now what's being trained in the model and where does that data come from. So those type of conversations still need to happen. A big thing about transparency, like as you start to author your own models for use, there's these standards for documentation, and you may have seen them out there called data cards or model cards, or at AWS we have things called service cards. And essentially, it's just a framework to document what that model is used for, what it's been trained on, and different parameters of how it's intended to operate. So as you're even just evaluating models to use, things like the model card should definitely be leveraged to see to ensure that that aligns with your enterprise standards. Um, Additionally, there's a lot of regulation around automated decision making. So again, human in the loop is not always a bad thing here as well. So I guess we're still afraid of the war games kind of scenario and the Skynet coming across. So at the moment, being conservative, we have to consider like how what our intention is always to automate, but how we can always keep a human in the loop to improve the uncertainty of what improve the certainty of how that model is supposed to operate. Also, things like workload classification, profiling. Really, this comes down to the principle of least privilege. Like for profiling, should I really be putting my customer's data in the model? So anytime personal data comes into play, just like today with PII or PCI type of data, we need to understand if it's really needed, and if it's not, then we just need to mask it or take it out of any kind of training. And as well as safety, just making sure that, again, the Skynet and the war games kind of scenario, that these systems are not built to keep any harm to humans as a result of it. And again, all these are tied together to ensuring that we have the transparency and the controls in place to be responsible with artificial intelligence. And I'll just close here. I mean, AWS is committed to driving adoption, developing AI in a responsible way. And like I've gone through a couple concepts, nothing about services or any of that. They're really just more concepts and best practices that we've seen as the generative AI space is evolving. But there's key things that we're trying to invest in here. So advancing the science of responsible AI. So we have different teams across not just AWS, but also in Amazon that are developing what generative AI looks like in the future. As well as we're putting responsible AI from theory to practice. This session hopefully is one example of that, where we're just not following, we're also trying to lead in this space. So we also have teams involved with the ISO teams and understanding how we can all work together to make AI deploy responsibly, as well as taking into account the end-to-end picture. We've kind of talked about data, how it ties into model training, but really this comes into data ingestion all the way to data output. So definitely ensuring that we look at end-to-end just from an infrastructure perspective from AWS, but also for our customers. And also just to engage the stakeholders on responsible AI. So we're in all the meetings with Biden and everything that goes on with that. So we're part of the long term for generative AI. So I think with that, that's what I wanted to share. Again, nothing technical, mostly just about compliance and privacy. And I'll leave it there. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'll hand it back to you, Ron.